my name's Kayla, this is Cinnamon the Score Bunny, and if you wanted to learn everything about the Pokemon multiverse, you came to the right place. There is so much confusion out there in the fandom, so I figured I would make this series and kind of clear all of that up. This video is going to cover the main series Pokemon games through Gen 5, so aka before Mega Evolution. I'm also going to include any of the remakes with the generation that they were created in, not the generation that they actually are. So for example, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, I'm going to talk about when I talk about Gen 4. It just makes a lot more sense to talk about it that way because some of the remakes include Mega Evolution. And Mega Evolution is a whole other can of worms, so we're going to talk about that when we talk about Generation 6, 7, 8, and a little bit of 9 in the next video. Let's start with Generation 1, the very first Pokemon games, Red and Blue. There was also obviously Green in Japan, but that doesn't change what I'm going to talk about, so we're just going to ignore that for now. I know you're probably thinking there wasn't really a multiverse in Gen 1, right? But you'd be wrong. Even in Generation 1, they cleverly hinted that this was going to be a multiverse type of situation. One of the most obvious ways this was communicated is that in Red and Blue, there were version exclusives, Pokemon that were only available based on the type of game you played. So for example, Red had these specific Pokemon that were exclusive to it, and Blue had these Pokemon that were exclusive to it as well. Note, because this is important later, Growlithe was only in Red and Vulpix was only in Blue. In terms of the lore that explains these differences, these two games exist in different versions of reality, different parallel universes where many things are in common, but in one version of reality, Growlithe was more successful at surviving, or maybe Vulpix never existed, or vice versa. Additionally, each individual save file is also its own parallel universe. We know this because each save file has slightly different events occur within it. In Red and Blue, we see this especially with our choice of starter Pokemon between Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander. Immediately, the game branches into 3 distinct paths. And from there, based on the Pokemon you encounter and the different scenarios you encounter when you're battling, the game branches even more. Like, imagine if the first Pokemon you catch is a Pidgey and you decides to raise that Pidgey. The experience that you would have in a gym like Erica's, for example, is going to be vastly different from someone whose first Pokemon was Rattata and they just decided to train that one up instead. While you can make a whole bunch of choices that impact the universe that you're living in, the basic events of the storyline still stay the same. You defeat 8 gym leaders, take on Team Rocket, and challenge the Elite Four to become the champion. So while each save file of Red and Blue is a separate universe, they are parallel. They have similar things that happen in each of them. Now, some universes might be closer than others, like 2 copies of Red are going to be closer than a copy of Red and a copy of Blue, because the experiences that you have across will be more similar. So as we go through this, we're going to talk about what universes are most closely related. But yeah, since we have multiple parallel universes, we have a multiverse! Kayla, what about Pokemon Yellow? I'm glad you asked! Pokemon Yellow takes place in another parallel universe to Red and Blue. For those of you unfamiliar with Yellow, it is very similar to Red and Blue, but you start with Pikachu and its storyline is kind of a cross between the anime and games. This is important because it means that in addition to the games being in parallel universes with each other, the anime and side games and basically everything else in the Pokemon franchise exists in these different parallel universes. So we're gonna find things in common for Pokemon across literally everything. But it would be a lot to cover that in one video, so we're gonna focus on the main games for now. Speaking of which, after Generation 1 came Generation 2, which was Gold, Silver, and Crystal. These games were made to be sequels to Generation 1. Specifically, they occur 3 years after Red, Blue, and Yellow. We've already established that some universes are more similar than others. So it stands to reason that some of these games might tie in more closely with certain prequels than others. We can look at the version exclusives of each games to kind of figure out which universes are most closely related to each other. As I said before, Growlithe is only in Red and Vulpix is only in Blue. Similarly, Growlithe is only in Gold and Vulpix is only in Silver. So Gold most closely resembles a future version of Red, Silver to Blue, and Crystal, well, Crystal is obviously yellow because Crystal includes Yassine, who is a character in the anime as well. But how can they possibly be sequels when we can make different choices as players in the Generation 1 games? Well, the parallel universes of Gen 2 assume that certain choices were made in Generation 1. By looking at what choices seem to have been made in the prequel versions of Generation 2, we can figure out what is the most commonly occurring path in the multiverse. This helps us make generalizations that we can carry across different games because these seem to be pretty consistent for the most part across all of the games. For example, regardless of if you play Gold or Silver, the character Red is representative of the main character, whereas Blue is representative of the rival. We can look at this kind of information to figure out a general Pokemon timeline, which kind of shows what the most commonly occurring events in the multiverse were. Obviously, that would be like a whole nother video in itself, and while this video will talk a little bit about some timeline things, I can't go through every single tiny event, or this video would be like really long. So Gold, Silver, and Crystal are parallel universes to Red, Blue, and Yellow that take place 3 years in the future. And specific things happen in common in the past prior to these games that are set in the future, such as Red and Blue being very distinct characters. Before we go on and make this more complicated, let's talk about interconnectivity between games. In Generation 1, we used the link cable to trade and battle with other players. We didn't think that much of it, to be honest, because it was all just Red and Blue, and you know, they were in the same time, so it was just like, oh, it's just a game. Like, we didn't think about it in like a multiversal sense for the most part. I don't know, maybe some of the older kids thought about it that way, but like, I played Pokemon Blue when it came out and I was like 5. So yeah, 5-year-old me did not understand the concept of a multiverse. But when Gen 2 came out and we were able to trade across time, people started to do some digging into the lore behind this. And the people creating the games must have known that people would start digging into this because they put an explanation into the lore. There was a thing called a time capsule that you had to use in order to trade Pokemon with the past. And that kind of made sense. A lot of people thought that we were just sending our Pokemon to the past, no multiverse shenaniganry, just a simple transfer over time. But there's an obvious problem with that. Usually when there's any sort of time traveling shenaniganry going on, it kind of messes with the timeline. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard the stories of like, oh, this person is their own grandfather because time travel. While the Pokemon lore didn't do a great job of explaining this in Generation 2, it did flesh out some details later on. We know that when we are trading Pokemon to the past or to the future, it's not that we're trading to the direct past of this game. The events of the game are still occurring as they occurred. There's no way to actually go back in time using any sort of link cable, trading, that kind of a thing. Instead, what we're doing is we're trading with a parallel universe that also exists in a different time. If we're playing Pokemon Red and Pokemon Gold at the same time in our reality, like the actual real world, there's a universe occurring in the past and a universe occurring in the future. So by trading Pokemon between the past and the future, we're not just trading within that one game, we're trading from one universe, Pokemon Red, to another universe, Pokemon Gold. The Pokemon aren't traveling through time, they're actually traveling from one universe, one version of reality to another. This means that the changes made don't impact our characters' pasts directly, so no Pokemon being their own grandfathers. I do want to acknowledge the only actual instance of in-universe time travel in Pokemon, which is Celebi. We see this in the anime, but it's brief and limited to what's already happened. We never see a situation where in-universe events can be changed through time travel. Keep this in mind for your Pokemon Legends Arceus theories because I keep seeing some really weird things out there. On to Gen 3, which didn't actually add that much to the multiverse. Well, until the remakes, but like, we're not gonna talk about that right now because Mega Evolution. We know that Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald take place at about the same time as Red, Blue, and Yellow because of this famous official timeline post. If you've never seen this post, I highly recommend looking it up at some point. It is very much legit. This is the official timeline. To emphasize that Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald take place at relatively the same time as Red, Blue, and Yellow, they released remakes of the Generation 1 games. Fire Red and Leaf Green follow mostly the same story as the Generation 1 games with slight variations, including the ability to play as a girl who is referred to as either Leaf or Green in other universes, just like how in the Gen 2 games we see the characters Red and Blue. We can't really use version exclusives here to match up the games because Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald have very different Pokemon than Red, Blue, Yellow, Gold, Silver, Crystal, literally all of the other games. But I think it's reasonable to assume that Ruby, the Red Stone named game, matches up with Red and Gold, and Sapphire, the Blue Stone, matches up with Blue and Silver. Emerald, being the third version, again with more references to the anime, matches up with Yellow and Crystal. The most important thing in Generation 3 to the Pokemon Multiverse is what I'm gonna call the Darkest Day motif. Prior to Generation 3, the biggest threat that the main character had to face was Team Rocket. But going forward, while still usually instigated by the evil team, the biggest threat is a lot more intense. For example, in Gen 3, the evil team raises either Kyogre or Groudon, which causes torrential rain or intense heat. So in other words, your goal is to stop climate change. That's a lot more of an existential threat than what Team Rocket is doing in Generations 1 and 2. Plus, the big bad legendary event is isolated to about 1 day. So we have our Darkest Day. We'll see this across other Pokemon generations as well. I might even do a video kind of charting all of the darkest days that we've seen across the timeline, but we don't have time for that right now because there are so many other things to talk about. Gen 4 added a ton of lore to the multiverse, like arguably more than any other generation. Because of the official timeline post, we know that Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum take place at the same time as Gold, Silver, and Crystal. So that means they take place 3 years after Red, Blue, Yellow, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Diamond matches up with Red, Gold, and Ruby because Scyther is a version exclusive in both Diamond and Red. Pearl matches up with Blue, Silver, and Sapphire because Pinsir is a version exclusive in both Pearl and Blue. And Platinum, as the third version with more anime references, matches up with Yellow, Crystal, and Emerald. In terms of lore and legendaries, there is something I need to point out about Dialga and Palkia because I keep seeing people getting it wrong all the time. While Dialga and Palkia have dominion over time and space, they are never shown bringing anything or anyone with them. Time and space travel are not something that they actually do. They're closely intertwined and can't really use their powers separately. Like if Dialga was to just change the time without changing space, the whole universe would basically collapse in on itself, as we almost see happen in the Gen 4 games. They're not like Celebi, who functions more as a traditional time traveler. Dialga and Palkia are more like curators of space and time, making sure space and time flow smoothly. This includes fixing space-time distortions caused by Giratina. Speaking of Giratina, what's the deal with the distortion world? Is that a parallel universe too? Nope. The distortion world is another dimension, not a parallel reality. This is explicitly stated across Pokemon, so this is not just a theory, this is actual legit lore. But people might not know the difference between parallel universes and dimensions, so let's explain some string theory. We've already talked about parallel universes and how they work. Dimensions are things like 2D, which is flat, 3D, which is like Score Bunny plushie, which can go in multiple directions, not just flat, aka 3D is huggable. According to largely accepted scientific theories, especially string theory, there are other dimensions past the third. The fourth dimension is space-time, or how objects exist across space and time. For example, if I have my Score Bunny plushie over here, and I move my Score Bunny plushie over here, at one point the Score Bunny plushie occupied this space, but at another point, the Score Bunny plushie occupied this space. If we were going to chart Score Bunny across space-time, it would kind of be one continuous continuous blur across these two spaces. In Pokemon, this concept is represented by Dialga and Palkia because obviously time and space. The fifth dimension we likely perceive as gravity, and anybody who has seen the distortion world knows that gravity gets a little bit crazy there. Additionally, it's theorized that the way that we perceive light is influenced by the fifth dimension. And who's a giant, scary, shadowy monster? Giratina. Giratina is basically the ruler of gravity, just like Dialga and Palkia are the rulers of time and space. I know a lot of people might be like, but what about antimatter? Doesn't Giratina connect to that? But like, I can't explain the connection between the fifth dimension and antimatter. It's all just really complicated science stuff. So we're moving on. Even more fascinating is Arceus, who is basically Pokemon's version of a creator deity, or rather a fragment / representation of the creator. Realistically, we know that the actual creators of Pokemon are real life humans in our own universe, so Arceus tends to be pretty meta. Like in this cutscene where Arceus shows the player images from the real world. Whenever we have interactions with Arceus, we should read this as the creators of the Pokemon games talking to us, the players, directly. Arceus represents the creative spark, the imaginary egg from which Pokemon as an idea was formed and created. Everything in Pokemon comes from that idea, aka it comes from Arceus. So does Arceus exist in a parallel universe or another dimension or what? Well, if Arceus is a representation of imagination, then it doesn't live in reality at all. If you think about your own imagination, it just kind of exists in your head. Because of this, for the sake of this series, we're going to call the place between realities where Arceus resides the metaphysical plane. Because Arceus exists in the metaphysical plane outside of universes or dimensions, it can move things across different parallel universes. This makes a lot of sense because through imagination, we can imagine that we are in different places or times or whatever. There's also the lore about Arceus' 1,000 arms, which are said to have shaped the universe. There's a fan theory that I personally think is credible that the unknown were these 1,000 arms, which makes a lot of sense because the unknown look like a letter system, aka a code. So basically, if we translate this into what they mean, Arceus, the creator's imagination, used the unknown, the code, in order to create the Pokemon multiverse. Here's where I would talk about Heart Gold and Soul Silver, but they are very similar to Gold and Silver, with most of the changes being mechanical, graphical, and to the in-universe lore. Like with the rival referred to as Silver in most universes being Giovanni's son. Love all the details, but they don't impact the multiverse too much. Gen 5 is a little bit more ambiguously placed than the other generations. This is probably because Gen 5 takes place in New York City, and all of the other generations take place in different parts of Japan. It makes sense that if the worlds in the Pokemon multiverse are laid out the same as our worlds, then there might be a little bit of a disconnect when events happen on the opposite side of the world. Because of this, Gen 5 is one of the most difficult to place on the timeline. We know it's after Silver, Gold, Crystal, Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, but like how far after? The best indicator is the character Caitlyn, who is 14 years old in Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver. She's also in Black and White as an Elite Four member, but she looks significantly older. It's hard to say exactly how much older though. We're just gonna say 10 years, but it could be a little more or a little less. That means that Pokemon Black and White take place about 10 years after all the other games. In terms of which universes they're most closely related to, this also gets weird. For the other games, we mostly use version exclusives to figure this out. Black has Houndour and Murkrow, which are split between Pearl and Diamond. White has Poochyena and Mischievous, which are split between Diamond and Pearl. The version exclusives no longer match up, so we can't use this to figure out which versions are more closely related on the timeline. There's literally nothing I can find that can place like Black as closer to Red or White as closer to Red or any of that. So it seems like these are just kind of separate. I mean, that also kind of makes sense because they're on the other side of the world, so regardless of what happens over there, these type of things are gonna happen over here. Black 2 and White 2 are easy to place. It explicitly says that they take place 2 years after Black and White. These are the first and only mainline sequels as opposed to remakes or new games. Still, we gotta keep in mind that Black 2 and White 2 exist in separate universes, so even though they are technically sequels to Black and White, it's not like they're gonna follow exactly. They're still gonna have those like similar events that happened in the past with some slight changes. So that's all the main Pokemon games before Mega Evolution makes the timeline go crazy. But I wanted to make sure we all understood the basics, so when I'm like, that's Wally, but not the Wally you remember, you're like, oh, okay, makes sense, as opposed to, you're crazy. And so that people will hopefully create less of the, this character is a time traveler theory. Like if another person tries to tell me that Bolo is a time traveler or that Kogita is Cynthia from the future, I'm going to lose my mind. In the next video in this series, I'm going to go through Generation 6, 7, 8, and possibly even a bit of Generation 9. I'll talk about the Mega Evolution timeline as well as the many implications of that, as well as place these games. If you learned something new, leave a like and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video in this series. Bye!